Hi, it's Jamie, Progressive's Employee of the Month, 2 months in a row. Leave a message at the... Hi, Jamie. It's me, Jamie. I just had a new idea for our song about the Name Your Price tool. So when it's like, tell us what you want to pay, hey, 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 and the trombone goes, blah, 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 and you say, we'll help you find coverage options to fit your budget. Then we just all do finger snaps while a choir goes, savings coming at ya, savings coming at ya. Yes? No? Maybe? Anyway, see your practice tonight. I got new lyrics for the rap break.
Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Welcome to Creating a Family. Talk about adoption and infertility. Today we will be talking with a panel of mothers who are raising children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. This is an issue we get a lot of questions on. We get questions from people who are trying to make the decision on whether to adopt a child that has FASD or they think might have FASD. And we also get questions from people who are in the midst of parenting. I think this interview today will be very useful to both. Here's a sample of what you will hear.
He's seriously impacted, and yet he has an IQ of 120. He's incredibly bright. The invisibility of this disability is the hardest part. People look at him and see a bright, intelligent young man, unless something glitches for him in the moment, and then they kind of scratch their heads, but it still doesn't add up to him being as disabled as he truly is.
I'm Dawn Davenport. I'm the director of Creating a Family. We are the National Adoption and Infertility Education and Support nonprofit, and you can find us online at creatingafamily.org. One of the things we do here at Creating a Family is provide online education for parents and for social workers. And we have courses that are specifically address fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, parenting, long and short-term impacts, lots and lots of courses with great experts that will be able to help you either make the decision on whether to adopt or help you raise the child that you've already adopted. I strongly recommend you check them out. You can go find them. Go to our website, creatingafamily.org. Hover over the word on the horizontal menu at the top, online courses, and click on, if you're a social worker, click on the social worker courses. But if you're a parent, click on courses for adoptive parents, and then you can search for prenatal exposure. And I think you'll really, really enjoy them. The Creating a Family radio show is underwritten by our corporate sponsor, Ferring Pharmaceutical. For women who have been undergoing fertility treatment and are still struggling to conceive, there are a lot of things that happen daily that just take a big toll on your emotional health. There is a new app that was released called Ferticom, and it is an app for both the Apple and the Android phones, and it was developed by reproductive psychologist Dr. Alice Domar and Elizabeth Grill. Allie has been on the show, Dr. Domar has been on the show a number of times. She is terrific, and I think Dr. Grill is as well. And it's designed to really help women address the many challenging emotional life-type situations that arise when you're struggling to conceive. The app can be found at, well, first of all, you can go to either the Apple Store or the Google Play Store and get it there. To get more information about it, however, you can go to their website, which is Ferticom app, FERTICALM app.com, and you'll get lots of information on it then. And let me tell you also about an upcoming infertility conference that is going to be great for both professionals as well as patients. It is the Midwest Reproductive Symposium International. It's going to be taking place this June 15th, 16th, and 17th. It's going to be in Chicago. So if you are in the Chicago area, I cannot recommend it enough. And quite frankly, even if you aren't, flights are cheap to Chicago. So get on one, come, and you will learn a tremendous amount. And also you can drop by the Creating a Family table. We're going to be exhibiting, and I will be speaking there, and I would love to see you. This show, as well as all the resources provided by Creating a Family, could not happen without the generous support from our gold sponsors who believe in our mission of providing unbiased education and support to those struggling to create a family. Some of our wonderful gold sponsors include Children's Connection. They're an adoption agency providing services for domestic infant adoption and embryo donation and adoption throughout the U.S. They also do home studies and post-adoption support to families in Texas. And we have Holt International. Founded in 1956, they want every child to have a loving and secure home, and they lead the global community in finding families for children who need them, and, most importantly, providing the pre- and post-adoption support they need to thrive. You can find out how to reach any of our sponsors by going to our website, creatingafamily.org, and looking under either the infertility or adoption tab and go to the Find the Professional page. Today we're going to be talking with 3 moms by adoption who are raising children with prenatal alcohol exposure. We're going to be talking with them to find out what it's really like when you are in the day-to-day work of parenting. We have, first, Laura Jenkins. She has 5 children, 4 of whom have fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. We have Cindy LaJoy, who has 5 children, 3 of whom have FASD. And we have Laura Block. She is the mom to a 20-year-old son with FASD, and she serves on the board of the Minnesota Organization of Fetal Alcohol Syndromes, otherwise MOFAS. Welcome, everyone, to Creating a Family and to this interview.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Yeah. Okay. I want to start by having you kind of fill us in and telling us your story of you're all adoptive mom with kids on the fetal alcohol spectrum, and I'm curious to know if you knew ahead of time that your children had been exposed prenatally to alcohol and had symptoms of FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and how significantly your children are impacted. We have 2 Lauras on today's show, so I'm going to distinguish between Laura Jenkins and Laura Block to make this interview go a little smoother. So, Laura Jenkins, if you could start by telling us kind of your story.
Yes, thank you, Dawn. I have 5 children, as you mentioned, 4 of whom were originally adopted from Kazakhstan. I adopted my oldest 2 children directly from Kazakhstan. I was not aware that either child had been prenatally exposed to alcohol. We knew that they had some other health-related issues, but were not informed at the time of any prenatal alcohol exposure. Both of those 2 have fairly minimal impacts. It's what our medical professionals have referred to as alcohol-related neurodeficiencies. They both have a form of attention deficit disorder that affects their executive functioning, but for the most part, they're fairly on track with their neurotypical peers. My next 2 were previously adopted by 2 different families from the same orphanage as my older children in Kazakhstan. They were brought to the U.S., and neither of those families were informed about the children's prenatal alcohol exposure either. Within about a year, due to behaviors exhibited by the kids, those parents made the decision to dissolve their adoption, and my husband and I then adopted them after their previous placements were dissolved. One of those does have a diagnosis of fetal alcohol disorder. She's fairly profoundly impacted, has cognitive impairments, a number of behavior issues, as well as some serious mental health issues. And my middle son actually really presents no behavior or cognitive impairments. He's, what we would consider to be a neurotypical college student. He's doing very well. And then my youngest, we're actually in the process of adopting through foster care, and we were given a great deal of information about his early childhood life. There was no documentation regarding prenatal alcohol exposure, but it's almost certain that he was prenatally exposed to both alcohol and opiates. And we were informed of this right up front by our local foster care department. And his behaviors really kind of run in the range of inability to regulate his emotions. He's very bright. but he's got some behavior issues and is in a significant emotional disabilities program through school. So that's kind of my experiences.
And one question before we move on to hear the other's experience. Is your youngest son's behavioral issues likely caused by prenatal exposure to alcohol and or opiates, or do you know?
We're having testing done, and the jury's kind of out because, again, we don't have a lot of the very early childhood information. He was first brought into care at the age of 2, but there were other children in the home who were born exposed to both alcohol and opiates, and so our suspicion is that he was exposed, and that he has very severe ADHD, which has been linked to prenatal alcohol and drug exposure, and he also has the executive functioning ADD as well, which has been linked to prenatal alcohol exposure.
And your children range in age, or your children who are on the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or the fetal alcohol spectrum, your children range in age from what to what?
Our youngest just recently turned 13, and our oldest is 27. And the children were 7 through 14 at the time of their placements.
Okay, so you have experienced both the younger ages as well as now into adulthood. All right, Cindy LaJoy, tell us about, you have 5 children, 3 of whom are on the alcohol spectrum. So can you tell us about what your experience has been, and did you know that they were exposed and likely to have these issues when they were adopted?
Sure. Our 5 are all adopted from orphanages in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Our first 2 were adopted as infants and are not on the spectrum at all. The third that came home, he was 8.5 when he came into our home. He was born with a bilateral cleft lip and palate. But that was all we knew. We didn't even have medical records pertaining to that. We initially didn't suspect that there was any sort of alcohol exposure. Because of the orphanage environment that he was in, we describe him as having been a little feral at the time. So a lot of behaviors that weren't able to be discerned until he had been home for a couple of years and settled in. And then I have my 2 daughters, neither of whom are diagnosed, but both of whom are very clearly impacted to some degree, and we're struggling. We can't get a diagnosis because we don't have records, but we do know that they were removed from the home because of alcohol and drug abuse of the mom, and they exhibit some of the classic stuff, but they're much less impacted than my son is. My son, we first began to recognize something was really off. Actually, on our adoption trip to get our daughters, and we were reading a book and explained a term to him, a new word. He had been home about 3 years at that point, and every page I had to re-explain what that same word was. And I must have done that 5 or 6 times. And I looked at my husband and said, this is not language learning. There's something really wrong here. We began to dig in a little more, and as is often typical, you get one diagnosis for a learning disability, and then you get another learning disability, and then another one, and no one really helps you put it all together underneath the umbrella of FASD. Kenny clearly had, it's you're putting it together really, because where we live is rural Colorado, and I have yet to speak to a single professional here, either at the school or within any of the other helping sort of services areas that actually knows what I'm talking about fetal alcohol exposure. They may have had a couple of days training at school, but they've never really worked with somebody that is identified and diagnosed as having it. You know that they're dealing with people with it, but it's not diagnosed and it's not called that. Mm-hmm. So Kenny was slowly diagnosed with various unspecified language disorders. He then had a diagnosis for central auditory processing disorder, which is quite debilitating for him. And then just kind of gradually we put two and two together, and we did pursue at the University of Washington's Fetal Alcohol Syndrome Clinic a diagnosis and got that last year, but we knew for a long time prior that that's what we were dealing with.
Right.
My daughters, one of them has dyscalculia, cannot do anything beyond third or fourth grade math. She's 17. She has, there's this disconnect that sometimes there's like a logic break with kids with on the spectrum, and that's present for her fairly often. Things that are very illogical, but to her seem quite logical, come out of her mouth. And even when you try to explain it, sometimes it doesn't click for her. We have, with two of the three, my other daughter is very mildly impacted and will probably have a pretty normal life, but she does have some memory issues, and my son has severe memory issues. My daughter, who's least impacted, she's 19 now, and she'll forget things that you've talked about or taught. We homeschool 200 times, and suddenly it's just gone, and when it's gone, it's really gone. She can't pull the information out. It's as if it's brand new to her when she hears it. And my son sometimes puts himself as being born in the 1800s. He forgets his name. And, kind of serious memory issues from time to time. He can't form mental maps in his head. He couldn't find his way around Walmart, regardless of the fact that we're there 4 times a week. He'll never drive. So he's seriously impacted, and yet he has an IQ of 120. He's incredibly bright. The invisibility of this disability is the hardest part. People look at him and see a bright, intelligent young man, unless something glitches for him in the moment, and then they kind of scratch their heads, but it still doesn't add up to him being as disabled as he truly is. Yeah. And so that's our situation.
Okay. Laura Block, can you tell us about your son and whether or not you knew ahead of time and how impacted your son is?
Well, my son is now 20. He was 3.5 when I adopted him, and at the time, that was even a question that I specifically asked: is this a possibility? Is prenatal alcohol exposure part of this picture? And I was told absolutely not with this child, nothing to worry about. And honestly, in those early years, he presented as a very neurotypical child, no issues, nothing that was of concern. And when he started school, looking back, there were just little pieces that started to present. Things like he couldn't hold a pencil in kindergarten like the other kindergartners could. There were some fine motor skill development delays, things like that. And by second grade, we were really feeling like, yeah, there's some things here we need to look at. And I'm extremely grateful. There was a man who spent a little bit of time with my son in a volunteer kind of position and said to me, I have 3 sons that have FASD, and I just see some similarities with Alex. Is this something you're aware of? I just want to put it on your radar. And to this day, I don't know who that man was, but I'm extremely grateful because being kind of a natural researcher, I went back home then, and, at the time, I said, oh, no, I've asked the question. That's not it. Thank you. Hopefully I was polite. But once I went home and started researching and, got on the Internet and started looking, it was yes, all the way down the line. And that's when we got Alex then to the University of Minnesota and got him diagnosed on the spectrum. But we're, in the grander scheme of things, we're very fortunate. His affect is mild, and yet it truly does affect every day of his life, every moment of how he's processing and how he experiences the world.
Cindy said it so well when she said that invisibility of the disability, which is not always the case. Laura, with one of your children, your child that is Laura Jenkins, the child that is most impacted, it sounds like his disability would not, or is it he or she? I think it's a she. That her disability would not be invisible at all. But with some of your other children who are less strongly impacted, would somebody who's having just a brief conversation even know that they're struggling? Laura Jenkins, hang on just 1 minute. Let me see. Let me try this again. Laura, I apologize. Let's try that again.
That's okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. As I was saying, even with our child who is most severely impacted, we've encountered the issue that Cindy described as the invisibility of it. And, we've had a number of people who, when they first meet our daughter, because she has the uncanny ability to be able to pull phrases or thoughts that she's heard others express into a conversation, she gives the appearance of being, of comprehending an issue far more so than she actually does. And, we've had school officials who've said, what are you talking about? She's fine. Early on, we really struggled with trying to put the pieces together, because if you just have a conversation with her and it's a few minutes or less, you probably wouldn't even be able to tell that there's any type of impairment or impacts unless you really knew what you were looking for. And it's only been, since we've learned to to ask more probing questions and, to begin to question her. If she says something that sounds very profound, you say, well, that's an interesting point. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And basically then what she reverts to is simply repeating the phrase that she's used. And when you start to ask, well, can you tell me why? Because of the difficulties in being able to understand more abstract concepts, she often can't explain something that she's heard, and then will become frustrated and act out. So it's only once you ask those probing questions that you really do realize that there's some fairly significant impairments happening.
And Laura Block, let's get our terminology straight. I think there is confusion. People used to use fetal alcohol syndrome, FAS, and then there were a lot of in between and of acronyms, and now it seems that the preferred acronym is fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, FASD. Can you explain the difference between FAS and FASD?
Yeah, and that is confusing. Thanks for bringing that up. FAS, fetal alcohol syndrome, was the initial diagnosis. It was back in the 70s, that's what they recognized. And FAS, to have that diagnosis, includes 3 significant facial features. One is small palpebral fissures, which means eye opening between your nose and your ear, that's narrow. Those eye openings are small. The second thing is a flat philtrum, which is that little ridge that we all have that runs from our nose to our upper lip. If that's flat, that's an indication of fetal alcohol syndrome. And the other thing is a very thin upper lip. So if you have those 3 physical features, you have the diagnosis of FAS. Now, what's interesting to note is that it's probably 5 to 9% of the children who live with the invisibility, the brain damage. Only 5 to 9% of those children actually have a recognizable facial feature or some form of physical recognition of their disability, which means 91 to 95% of our kids live with the invisible part of the brain damage, but not necessarily a recognizable physical feature that goes along with it. So FASD fetal alcohol spectrum disorder covers all of the brain damage, all of the other indications of disability based on prenatal alcohol exposure.
Right, and it also, by calling it a spectrum disorder, it also brings to the fore the reality that children are impacted in varying ways. It could be related to both the amount and the pattern of drinking that took place during their gestation and during their mom's pregnancy, as well as just perhaps their own temperament and their own genetic susceptibility. So for whatever, but children, and each of you have described, or both Cindy and Laura Jenkins have described children that show varying degrees of impact. Cindy, do you ever feel angry at your child's birth parents or your child's birth mom? And if so, how do you deal with that feeling?
Actually, I may be unique in the fact that I'm not, and I don't feel that way. I think that the fact that it's so prevalent here in the United States and yet is going undiagnosed, and some of the things that we've learned along the way have helped me kind of curb that anger. You know, a lot of the damage can be done before a woman even knows she's pregnant. How can you get angry with somebody who might have immediately stopped alcohol if they had known they were pregnant when they didn't know it, and so they had a drink? We also don't really understand the impact of how much alcohol, at what stage. You know, we're just beginning to have some research done into some of this and come up with some answers, but, you know, the zero alcohol at any point in time is great as long as you know you're pregnant. I have just chosen not to make that my focus. There's enough going on that's frustrating that I don't need to add in something from an anonymous person to deal with the anger that I might have for somebody who might never have done something intentionally to my child. That doesn't seem to be very healthy, and so I've tried to really avoid going there. There's moments when I truly wish I had my children from birth because I don't drink at all. And the ironic part is our family owns a liquor store. And so there's all kinds of conflicting feelings that come up around all kinds of this stuff. But that has been more where my brain has gone, is if I had my children from birth and in utero, this wouldn't have happened. But, of course, that wasn't going to happen. So, you know, for me, the anger is kind of energy that really, the rest of the energy dealing with the kids, that saps so much that I don't need to add to it.
Yeah, no, I hear exactly what you're saying. Laura Jenkins, are any of your children aware that their struggles are connected with the actions taken by their birth parents, and how do you parent through that? And is there a sense of frustration that they have, and if so, how do you help them?
I would say with our older two, there's a sense of denial. You know, we've spoken very openly with our kids about some of the likely causes for the difficulties that they face, but with our older two particularly, they will say, well, you don't know that to be true. You don't know that to be a fact. And they will become defensive of their birth parents. With, you know, our daughter who's most severely impacted, interestingly enough, she is the one who really seems to grasp that that these were actions taken by her birth mother while she was pregnant. And I think she feels a sense of sadness that she struggles, and she knows that she does struggle because her struggles are much more apparent than her siblings. And with our youngest, I think probably the first conversation that anyone ever had with him was a conversation that my husband and I had with him about 2 months ago. And during that conversation, we had some behavior issues in which he had acted out early on when we got custody of him. We really struggled with managing his rage. You couldn't say no because he would just have a violent outburst. And we've been working with an outstanding, just an absolutely outstanding psychiatrist in the Denver metro area, as well as an absolutely outstanding attachment therapist who've really helped us try to really foster that connection with him and that attachment. So it made it easy for us, easier than it did with our older kids, to say, we understand that you've got these struggles and you've got these difficulties, and let's talk about why it is that you do have these difficulties. And it was a very hard conversation to have with him, and he became very angry at his birth parents, especially his birth mother, because he was old enough when the parental rights were terminated, to have pretty strong memories about what that household was like and what it was like in the home to see parents, who were drinking and abusing drugs and had other adults coming into the home that were doing these kinds of things. And so, he's got very vivid memories, but he had never really put the piece together that his difficulties were a result of actions that they took before he was even born. And and once he kind of worked his way through that, and it's not something that we've really addressed in detail yet, simply because of his age and his maturity level, but it's something that he's aware of and that he understands, at least on some level, and periodically he'll bring it up. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough with him, one of the things that we talked about was one of the struggles that he has is that it impacts his ability to really discern body language and facial expressions. So it almost presents as an autism spectrum disorder, and he's not been diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum, but some of the struggles that he faces are very similar. Things like not being able to differentiate tones when people speak mm-hmm. to him, and knowing when someone is getting annoyed by his behavior. And so in a classroom setting where, he thinks children are, his friends, that, everyone's joking, when in reality other kids are getting very frustrated and then will act out against him. And, so we had a conversation about how this is one of the ways in which it presents. And, he walked away and he came back about an hour later and he said, so let me get this right. He said, because my birth mom drank when she was pregnant, he said, I can't tell when people are angry with me. And I said, well, yeah, that's one way to explain it. And then he just said, He said, well, that doesn't seem like it's so bad. And I kind of looked at him and he said, well, if I don't know that they're angry, he said, I just assume that, everyone likes me and everything's good. So that's not really that bad. And so it kind of shows you how a child, especially someone who had a very high IQ, can put certain pieces together while at the same time just having these impairments that you think, how does the kid get through the day? So it's a very, very complex disorder to live with, from as a parent, and I can only imagine what it's like for my kids.
Yeah. That raises a really good question, and that is, what are, if we can even say something like, the typical symptoms of being on the alcohol exposure spectrum? Laura Block, we've heard all three of you describe certain things that your children do. Can you just hit the high points of what some of the typical type of symptoms, behaviors that you might see with a child who has, or a young adult who has been exposed prenatally?
Sure. Some of the typical things are both what Laura and Cindy have described, where our children are not able to link action and consequence, and it makes it, we try very hard to focus on the positive aspects. And one of the great things about our kids is that they live in the moment. They don't hold grudges. They're not worried about the future. they truly are able to just live in the moment. On the other side of that, they live in the moment. They're not able to learn from past actions, and they're not able to predict, if I do this, this will happen. And so they're not thinking about future consequences or where those actions will lead. I think that's one of the most typical things. Beyond that, I think there are some behavioral things. Our kids are very sensory driven. And so if you think about it, kids that aren't able to link action and consequence, kids that have a lack of impulse control, whatever feels good in that moment is what they're going to do. And that can lead to some real challenging behaviors. I think often once our kids hit their teenage years, if you think about the typical teenage hormones and things that we all went through as young adults, and then you compound that with a lack of understanding of where those actions may lead, many of our young adults, our teens, are struggling with pornography, with sexually acting out. And I know, for me that was an interesting struggle when we hit those years, because I feel like, as the other moms have so beautifully described, when my child struggled in school, abstract concepts are very hard. So math, time, money, those things are a real challenge for our kids to comprehend. When my child struggled with those issues in school, I knew it was his disability. When my child struggled with social relationships, I knew it was his disability. When he started struggling with sexual issues, and particularly pornography, I felt like a bad parent. I felt like this was my fault, that I hadn't taught him or communicated well enough, morals and values. Those are such abstract concepts and not easily understood by our children. And it took me a long time to realize that also was part of his disability and not necessarily, bad parenting. Or there's so many people out there that look at us and think, if you just did this, if you just did that, you're a child. Well, that's not reality for us. That judgment that I felt so strongly from other parents and from the school system, I really had to go back to what's the disability, and then what's the rest of it.
Oh, I am so glad you raised the issue of the not being understood and the way we parent not being understood, because people don't recognize that our kids do have a disability, and therefore the way that we're parenting, we parent towards that and feeling judged. That's such a valid point. I wanted to talk a little about how, and because it's a spectrum disorder, I suspect we're going to hear a lot of different experiences with this, but how does prenatal exposure to alcohol impact cognitive development, IQ? Cindy, in your experience, how has prenatal exposure affected your children's ability to learn their IQ? In other words, what we typically think of how smart they are, that type of thing.
Well, let me start with Kenny, my most impacted. He wasn't able to read at a first grade level at 12 years old. We were literally watching this kid's love of learning and curiosity just go out the window, because once you hit 12, everything in school is presented in writing. And he couldn't read, and we couldn't figure out why he couldn't read. They tried 11 different phonics programs with him, and they couldn't get him any further beyond the 1 year level. The excuse we were offered was that he was an English language learner, and that eventually, don't worry, he'll catch up, and we saw that clearly wasn't happening. When we started homeschooling, because we literally had no other option, I went through 3 phonics programs, start to finish, within one that was designed specifically for those that are struggling readers. And he now reads at probably a 12th grade level. But it took us, we've been homeschooling him 7 years at this point to get there. Yet he can recite all of Roman history to you. He can discuss politics and all the nuances of it. I think the thing I would most describe it as is uneven. The ability to learn is there. He has to learn things visually, and we have found for him that he learns much better through discussion. And actually with all of our kids, if I just give them a book and say, here, read it, it's vague, it doesn't stick. The Teflon brain, it has to be presented in a certain way so that it sticks. And so we sort of, by trial and error, learned that video presentations of things, learning through story helps it stick with all of our kids. And then there are some things that no matter what you do, they can't learn it. My daughter, we have done everything possible to teach her math. She's 17 years old, and not too long ago, just a verbal question, how much is 2,000 minus 1,600? And she couldn't do it. And then she grabbed a piece of paper, and she couldn't do it and did it wrong twice. That's at 17 years old, and that's with intensive work with math. So there are some things that just absolutely won't stick. There are surprises with things that will stick. And mostly I would describe it as just completely uneven and unpredictable what your child grabs hold of and what they don't. And the hard part is the things that they do grab hold of, boy, do they know it. And so they sound quite intelligent talking to people, and they are if it's that area which things have cemented. But it fools people into thinking that they get things, and also there's a confidence. We've noticed with all 3 of our kids, they present as if they totally understand something because in the moment they think they do. But as Laura Jenkins was talking, when I ask my kids, okay, so repeat back to me, what do you understand that I just said? They completely got it wrong, probably 2/3 of the time. So there's this presentation to the world of a child who's pretty on it, who doesn't have some sort of outward sign that there's something wrong, and who also nods and understands and gives all the indicators that they're understanding what's being explained to them. The minute you stop and question them, they don't get it. But no one's going to know to stop and question them unless they understand there's brain damage, and that's probably the biggest problem with them that we've noticed with our kids. We, even with experience, sometimes assume that there's an understanding of the circumstance or a new learning that really isn't there. But because they're nodding their head enthusiastically and they're ready to go, all the indicators are that they get it, and they really don't. That's the hardest part for us.
Yeah, I get, and we have often heard the expression Cindy just used, the Teflon brain. We've also heard it called Swiss cheese brain. And I think there are different ways of trying to express the unevenness. Laura Block, you were just talking about symptoms of fetal alcohol exposure. Is that unevenness, the uneven ability to learn, is that a hallmark of the brain damage caused by alcohol exposure in utero?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the frustrating things is it's that corpus callosum that runs down the middle of the brain that is often damaged in our kids. And so they know the information. They're just not able to recall it in the moment that they need it. I think back about 2nd grade, again, when we were starting to see that there were some significant issues with my son Alex. He and I would work on spelling words. He'd come home with his little list. We'd memorize the list. He'd have them all down cold. He'd go off and play for an hour, and I'd say, let's just quick review these words. And it was like he'd never seen the list before. I knew that he knew them. I knew it was in there somewhere. But he couldn't access it when he needed to. And that affects our kids both in their schooling and, again, in predicting outcomes. If I do this, this will happen. They're not connecting those 2 pieces of what I know and accessing it in the moment that they need to.
And some of this does sound some of what both Laura and Cindy and you have described does sound a bit like symptoms of a child or a person on the autism spectrum. Is there any known overlap between the two? Is autism found more often in children that have been exposed prenatally to alcohol, or are these just symptoms that they share between the two very different disorders? Laura Block.
Well, if I could address that, we actually, FASD can very easily look like ADD or ADHD. It can look like autism. It can look like radical attachment disorder. It can look like depression. The symptoms are very common. And in fact, many of our researchers now are saying that a lot of the increase that we're seeing in autism is at least a dual diagnosis, that it may be autism. It is also just as likely that it could be FASD. One of the things we're finding here in Minnesota is even when a birth mother will admit to a medical professional, yes, I drank during my pregnancy or I drank before I knew I was pregnant, the medical professionals will often say, oh, yeah, we don't think it's FASD, we think it's something else. And so that is a very common thing that we're finding. And I think if you look at the symptoms, particularly of ADHD and of autism, there are a lot of overlaps. And they can certainly be co-occurring diagnoses. It could be both. But I think a lot of times it really is FASD, and it's just been misdiagnosed as something else.
You are listening to an interview with Creating a Family. We're talking today with a panel of moms who are raising children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, prenatal exposure to alcohol. We primarily keep in touch with our community through our weekly e-newsletters. We have one for adoption and one for infertility. You get to choose. It comes out once a week, and we let you know about the latest developments in adoption as well as the upcoming week's blog and show topics. You can receive this newsletter for free by signing up at our website, top right corner at creatingafamily.org. You know, I have often read that the best approach when trying to parent a child with prenatal exposure, or FASD, is to take the child's age and cut it in half, and that's the age where you expect them to act. Laura Jenkins, has this held true with your children, that we can that their behavior and their cognitive development and their reasoning is about half their actual age?
Absolutely. And it's in all four of my kids who are impacted. We're seeing that, with my oldest, now that he's in his late 20s, we're seeing the gap narrow. But particularly with our youngest, who's 13, from an emotional level, we're seeing, that he is, his teacher, for example, placed his emotional development at between 7 and 8 years old. And so, we'll in our kids, we see it primarily with the emotional, with the social skills, and not so much in their verbal communication, or even, as Cindy pointed out, in their academic achievements, because there's some areas in which, our kids are doing extremely well and, are surpassing their neurotypical peers in terms of their, academic development. But when you get to the social skills, they're just not there. And I would say absolutely probably that 50% mark is about right.
Yeah, which makes for a difficult parenting. Yeah. Let's go to now, Cindy, if you could talk to us about, I'm going to rotate between all three of you. I want to make this a practical interview as well, because we're going to be having people who are listening who need some takeaways. So, Cindy, give us one of your tips that you've learned from parenting children who are on the alcohol spectrum disorder?
I think for our family, we have been incredibly blessed not to experience the behavioral challenges that a lot of families have. Sometimes, it's the case of multiple placements with people not understanding children. Sometimes it's going years and years without a diagnosis and no one understands it. For us, I think we figured out fairly early on that our son's behavior and then later our daughter's quirks and oddities were not intentional. And very often, some of it can appear to be intentional. The single most life-saving thing that I think I could offer as a tip would be recognize that your child is not intending to do these things. A lot of the secondary issues that come along with families, the anger, the frustration, the acting out, some of the violence that is sometimes seen in kids, really is solely because a child is being told over and over again, well, you did it yesterday, why can't you do it today? Quit faking it. Why are you milking it? And the child literally cannot do today what they did yesterday. Can you imagine the frustration that runs through a kid who's being told they can do what today they really cannot do? This happens throughout their entire childhood, and they're being told that certain things are intentional that really, really are not. And it creates an anger and a simmering, I think, that often just erupts. And we've been very lucky to avoid that solely, I think, because we looked at our son and said, you know what, we know this isn't intentional. It's driving us all crazy. And we're a team and we're working on it together. This isn't your fault, and we know it. Simply believing that your child has a disorder they can't control is hugely important.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. All right, Laura Jenkins, can you give us a tip that you've learned in your experience that has helped you in parenting your children?
To sort of echo what Cindy said, I think educating yourself about the myriad ways in which fetal alcohol spectrum disorder presents in children and understanding that what you're seeing is the disability and the child really is impacted and isn't able to do some of the things that you may be asking him or her to do. And with that, I would couple that with identifying appropriate parenting strategies to meet your child's needs. Early on, we worked with a number of professionals who were very regimented in their approach to parenting. And, we were really led to believe that our children's behaviors were deliberate, that they were the result of institutionalization, that they didn't know how to behave appropriately. And so the parenting strategies that we were essentially given by many professionals that we sought help from, were almost militaristic in the approach, and they really, A, they didn't help the behaviors, and B, they really damaged the relationship and the connection between us and our older kids. And so now learning the attachment strategies from Dr. Karen Purvis's work and building that connection and understanding that you need to modify your parenting style, your communication style, your discipline to meet the needs of your child is just absolutely critical. And I wish that we had the knowledge now when we were raising our older kids.
Good. Words of wisdom learned the hard way. All right, Laura Block, can you share a tip that you've learned in your parenting experience with children who are on the alcohol exposure spectrum?
Yeah, I would say I think the hardest lesson for me to learn was to surround myself with people who really want to understand my child. I initially, because I had gone through infertility first, and then when I adopted that, now I'm going to be part of the normal mommy group, and then that didn't happen, I really struggled with feeling like a failure. And the people that I turned to, my own family, my own mom, well-intentioned, loving people, they just didn't get it. And I learned to create for myself a network of people that were willing to listen to me when I said, as Cindy so beautifully described, you could spend a long time with my son and not recognize that he has a disability. He can parrot back language that's very appropriate, that sounds like he knows, he's on track with his peers, he knows what he's saying, but it's truly just parroting back language. He doesn't understand what he's saying. And so, at 17, when I was still treating my son, as you said, kind of half that age thing, he still needed the supervision of an 8-year-old. And not every parent gets that. And so it was really important for me to find friends and a circle, a network of people that supported the fact that, yep, he's 17, yep, he looks like every other 17-year-old, but I needed people who understood why I treated him like he was 8 in certain areas, and that it wasn't, I wasn't being a helicopter parent. I wasn't over-parenting or, having a hard time letting go. That wasn't the issue. The issue is my son truly needed the protection that you would normally put in place for an 8-year-old. And finding people that understood that, people who supported me in that, people who were willing, when my son was over playing with their kids, to understand he still needs the supervision of an 8-year-old, that was really critical for us.
And Laura, how did you find your peeps, your village, the people who got you, or got, more importantly, got your parenting, but got your son? How did you find them?
It was trial and error. Like I said, the people that I had turned to in my life prior to that, my own parents, my siblings, they didn't get it. And that was really hard for me. I felt constantly like I was having to defend my parenting decisions. For me, it was the people that live around me. It was my neighbors. We have a group of 5 families in our neighborhood. And I think because they were close, because they saw on a daily basis what I was describing, that really helped. It really does take someone who is intricately involved, who can see day after day, year after year, what we were dealing with. It's really, I don't judge them. It's really hard for someone to come in a couple of times a year for a weekend or two and really see what it is that we're living with. It's the people that are there every day that have a better chance of understanding the daily life.
Yeah, that makes very good sense. Cindy, can you talk to us about the importance of routines, creating routines for kids who have the brain damage caused by exposure to alcohol?
Certainly the routine and the structure, which sometimes we aren't as good at, because let's face it, a real life just doesn't always allow for it, especially when you have 5 kids. It's imperative for kids like this. Our son in particular doesn't have the ability to initiate daily tasks. He would stay up literally until 4 o'clock in the morning unless he was told to go to bed. It's sad to say, but we only realized this about 1.5 years ago because he was following along so well. There's an adaptability there. And he kind of followed along with his siblings, and so if he saw them going to bed, he'd go to bed. But as they grew older and schedules became kind of more flexible, we realized Kenny didn't have the ability to initiate, I'm tired, I need to go to bed. He doesn't have the ability to initiate, I'm hungry, I think I need to eat. He watches when everybody else eats, and then he eats. So the routine and the structure is important for a lot of reasons. First of all, because they can't initiate very often. And second of all, because there's enough craziness going on in their brain that the routine allows for something to be predictable. Everything else is unpredictable. How they're going to respond on a given day is unpredictable. If their brain's going to work really well today, or if it's going to make information completely inaccessible is unpredictable and out of their control. And so having the schedule be as predictable as you can manage to make it, and the setting be the same. For example, like not moving furniture in your house regularly, keeping things in the same location regularly when a child has memory issues helps a little bit. There are a lot of things that come to the predictability piece that help when everything else can't be controlled and is kind of chaotic in their brain. And so for multiple reasons, emotionally, it helps keep them stable if the schedule is a little more structured. And if the environment is more structured, we're incredibly careful about sound in our home because of the auditory processing disorder. So we try to keep the home quieter and calmer. And with 5 teenagers, it's easier than we think because everybody else's life is better when Kenny is doing better. And too much sound, too many TVs on loud, too much going on literally makes the next 3 or 4 days almost unbearable with him because he can't get his brain back together, so to speak. It sort of jumbles it. So there's all kinds of ways in which that comes into play for us.
All right. Laura Jenkins, how have your children shown difficulties in making transition between activities, even simple activities, getting in and out of not getting in the car, but knowing that we're leaving to go to the grocery store. We've got to stop playing now. We've got to get in the car, and we've got to go to the grocery store, and then we've got to come back doing this type of thing. Do your kids struggle with transitions? And if so, how have you dealt with that?
Very much so, and that was actually one of the first issues that was brought to our attention with our oldest son, and it was brought to our attention by his teachers at school. They would, for example, tell him, okay, you need to put your math away because now it's science time. And if he wasn't done, then he would really struggle and he would act out and he'd want to finish those math problems. And initially, they kind of attributed it to, well, he's learning English. It's an ELL issue. It's, they gave us all kinds of excuses as to what was causing this. And in reality, what he needed and what we've since done with our other kids is to give warning. So we'll say, today, at 3:00 we're going to this place. And so at 2:30, so the kids know in advance, we have a weekly calendar on our fridge that gets updated with the highlights it has for each day of the week, what time we're doing whatever activity and who's involved. Then we also have a 2-month at a glance calendar in which we put, the things that are coming out. What's happening in May, what's happening in June. And then so they can get a visual sense of when things are going to be happening. And particularly with 2 of our 4 who are impacted, we do have to, constantly remind them, don't forget, after school today, is your cousin's graduation. We're going to be leaving at 4:00. And after school, when it comes to 3:00, we'll remind again and say, at 3:30, you need to get dressed and you need to get ready. And so at 25 after, we'll say, okay, in 5 minutes you need to do this. And there's a lot of 5-minute warnings, 10-minute warnings. It's time to do X, Y, and Z. And once we started employing these types of strategies, it made it a whole lot easier for our kids to prepare for and transition from one activity to another.
Yeah, I can absolutely. As you were speaking, one of the things, and Laura Block, I'd like for you to address this, as I'm listening to all of you speak, it just seems like parenting children who with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders takes a lot of patience. It just seems like you've got to get that needs to be the forefront of your head, that you need to approach this with patience and do whatever you can to take care of yourself so that you don't get frustrated. Because it does sound like it could be very frustrating.
Yeah,
and Laura,
absolutely.
This block I'm asking you right now. Go ahead.
Yeah, it is frustrating, and it's. I think there are a lot of moments that I have questioned myself and my parenting abilities, and we have a great moms group here, and one of the other moms has Post-it notes that she's put all over her house that just say BD for brain damage, just to remind her that when her child is acting out, it's brain damage. It's not willful disobedience. It's not all the other things it looks like. And I've been so inspired by that because I think that's one of the critical things is in self-care and protecting ourselves as parents, we need to remember that this isn't willful misbehavior. It's not, and to that point, no, I don't believe any woman ever drinks with the intention of harming her child. It wasn't an intentional act on the birth mother's part, and it's not an intentional act on my child's part. This is just the reality of what it's like to live with prenatal exposure to alcohol.
Yeah, and that is so darn hard. The last question I have for each of you are resources that you have found that have helped you. Laura Block, can you tell us resources? One of which I'm sure will be the website to the Minnesota Organization of Fetal Alcohol Syndrome, which I will give at the end of the interview as well, and that's mofas.org. But in addition to that, can you tell us any other resources that you have found helpful?
You know, I think just in general, continuing to learn about, because in the medical field, this is a relatively new diagnosis. FAS, as we talked about earlier, wasn't even identified as a medical condition until the 70s. So every year we're learning so much more. So just continuing to do research and continuing to look online for what's new, what are we learning, and I think some of the more severe cases were recognized earlier on, but really most of our kids, many of them don't fall into that severe category. So what are the more subtle symptoms? And just continuing to learn about that. And obviously I'll promote the mofas.org site because they have phenomenal resources there. And the funny thing is that when we were going through the initial diagnostic process with my son, and I was doing all my research, many of the things that I printed out came from the mofas.org site, and I didn't even realize it until years later when I was connected with the organization that was where I had received so much of this great information. But I think just the process of continuing to learn, continuing to research, continuing to remind ourselves as parents that, like I said, this is not willful misbehavior. This is the result of prenatal alcohol exposure.
Laura Jenkins, any resources that you would like to give that have been helpful to you?
Sure, thank you, Dawn. I would recommend two different sources of information. One of the things that really helped connect the dots for me with our kids was actually your website and going through and listening to some of the podcasts. And when our son got a diagnosis of ADHD, I went back and I listened to that, podcast. And so, going back and listening to those podcasts, it really helped me to kind of put pieces together. And so that was very helpful. And then also there's a couple of really good Facebook groups. And I sometimes hesitate to recommend something like a social media type group because you do get a wide variance in people's experiences and as well as how people behave on some of those forums. There's that anonymity that comes with being on social media can lead people to sometimes behave, not as kindly as we'd like and be very judgmental. But there are also some very good lists out there that are communities of both mothers and fathers who are raising children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And I found those to be not just good sources of information about what my children were facing, but also good resources for me to forgive myself for my lack of patience and frustration that I experienced, particularly with my older kids, because I didn't know any better. And, so those were two very excellent sources of information, help, and support for me.
And you can find the Facebook groups by typing in fetal alcohol spectrum disorder into the Facebook search box, or do you happen to know the names of the two groups you mentioned?
There's two that I have found particularly helpful, and I believe one is called Parenting Children with FASD, and I think the other one is Parenting Teens and Adults with FASD. And both of those communities, they're well moderated. When problems pop up, there's people will post an issue, and there's a lot of good dialogue on both of those lists, and a lot of very experienced parents.
Okay, excellent. Okay, and we'll include a link to those in the blog that we talk about with the resources. All right, and last but not least, Cindy, if you could talk to us about any resources that you've found that haven't already been mentioned that you would recommend for parents who are just starting out.
Sure. I would second it, and with the same caveats that Laura has said about Facebook groups or social media groups, but in particular finding specific parents who maybe are a little further down the road from you. That's been the best resource for me in some ways. The group brain itself can sometimes, the hive mind can offer a lot of things to think about that you might not have exposed yourself to in terms of medications and approaches and therapies. But there's nothing like finding a couple of parents who are going through the same thing that you can then have private conversations with and explain the frustration, vent in appropriate ways, and get appropriate feedback. But there's also another resource that is helping us now to think differently. We also used to explain to our 3 kids. We sat down and literally read it back and forth. And it was put out by the Community Living British Columbia website, and I'll send a link to you. And it's a PDF file called Supporting Success for Adults with FASD. We are finding as we're moving into the teens and the future, the lack of resources is a little stunning about what do you do once they're adults. There's an awful lot of material now finally available to help you figure out what's going on with younger kids, to diagnose it, maybe to work with it. But what do you do once they're adults and they still can't function? This has a lot of really good information explained in a way that can help your child better understand their brain dysfunction, and a lot of good suggestions for the kind of support that your adult child is going to need. And in our case, one for sure will never be independent. And it explains it from a more positive perspective of interdependence rather than dependency. And that word has become a key phrase in our family, interdependence, and that's the recognition that all relationships are interdependent. And so this brochure really supports understanding that all of us need help in some areas, and for some people with FASDs, they need more help. So it kind of differentiates the fact that you're not just the only one who needs help. Everybody does in some ways. You just need it in different ways. And it offers a lot of practical suggestions for dealing with everything from money to housing to cleaning to cooking for folks who really probably can't do all of that by themselves. But it also encourages some dependence where it's possible. So that's been a very helpful resource for us.
Thank you, and we will include that. Please do send the link, and we will include that. Thank you so much for being with us today. Let me remind everyone that keep in mind that the information given in this interview is general advice. To understand how it applies to your specific situation, you need to work with your adoption professional. Thank you for joining us. And if you've enjoyed our show, please help us grow by ranking this on the Apple Store, the Apple Podcast. That's how iTunes knows how to recommend us, and we would really appreciate that. The website, let me give again. Let me second that I have found the Minnesota Organization on Fetal Alcohol Syndrome to be an excellent resource, and that is MOFAS.org. as well as the National Association on Fetal Alcohol Syndrome, NOFAS.org. Thank you for joining us today, and I will see you next week.
The Starlight Lounge presents An Evening with the Progressive Box.
Moon, yeah.
That's Hugo, tickling the ivories. He just saved by bundling home and auto with Progressive. Gonna finally buy a ring for that gal of yours, Hugo? Send her my condolences. Hi-oh! This next one's for you two. There's a burglar in my heart. Thank you.
Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Discounts not available in all states or situations.
And now, an ad from Dad.
All right, save money on car insurance when you bundle home and auto with Progressive. Can I take these off? All right. What is this? This looks good. Wow. That's well made. Where did you get this? I'm talking to you with the hair. Yeah, where did you get this? It's good stuff. That's solid. That's not veneer. That's solid stuff.
Progressive can't save you from becoming your parents, but we can save you money when you bundle home and auto. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company, affiliates, and other insurers. Discounts not available in all states or situations.